Normandy, France, June 1944. Dawn crawled slowly over the hedgerows. A damp gray sky hung low above the fields of Normandy, mist clinging to the grass like smoke that refused to rise. From somewhere beyond the horizon came a pulse of distant thunder, not weather but steel. Every few seconds the air trembled. Then it began to roll in steady rhythm, boom after boom, the sound of U.S. guns opening the morning. In the still air the chorus turned relentless, blending into the constant hum of destruction that soldiers called simply the orchestra. German infantrymen, crouched in their trenches south of St. Lo, looked up from their foxholes. At first they counted the guns by flash. After the 10th flash, counting became pointless. The horizon was light itself, an unbroken wall of fire. Shells landed across the valley, white bursts kicking up soil and cattle bones, tearing through hedges that had stood for generations. The ground shook like breath drawn through a furnace. Officers shouted for communication lines. Nothing answered but echo. To many, the realization came at once: this wasn't artillery as they had known it. This was industry turned into weather, an American storm manufactured by precision, delivered by tonnage, and it was only the beginning. If you want more true stories told in the thunder and silence of World War II, subscribe now and march with us through history's most powerful moments, one battlefield at a time. When the Allied Armada crossed the English Channel on June 6, 1944, the eyes of the world focused on the beaches, yet the beating heart of the invasion sat miles offshore and behind it, inside the holds of Liberty ships, in the railway sidings of southern England, and along rows of olive-drab barrels aligned like an industrial assembly line pointing east. Those guns formed the most concentrated artillery capability the world had yet seen. Its doctrine, forged through bitter trial in North Africa and Italy, depended not simply on courage but on mathematics, communication, and logistics. By the time American infantry pressed into Normandy's hedgerows, gunnery had become a science of relentless precision. Call, calculate, fire, repeat. In the months before D-Day, the U.S. Army had learned that mobility won battles, but pre-plotted firepower secured them. The 105 M2A1 howitzer, light enough to move by truck yet devastating at 6 miles, formed the standard heartbeat of each division. The heavier 155 mm guns, nicknamed Long Toms, anchored corps-level barrages, while self-propelled M7 Priest and M12 GMC batteries followed armor forward. All were linked by field telephones, radio nets, and forward observers trained to shift entire grids of explosive destruction in minutes. Each salvo was less art than arithmetic. Azimuth, elevation, fuse time, 3 variables multiplied thousands of times a day. What distinguished American gunnery from its Axis counterparts was coordination. In 1942, fire missions had been confined to single battalions. By 1944, a U.S. Corps commander could mass dozens of battalions on one target through a standardized fire direction center. Artillery became an organism. Eyes forward, nerves of copper wire and radio waves, muscles of high-grade steel. It could breathe, respond, and consume. The organizational genius behind this evolution traced back to Fort Sill, Oklahoma, where the pre-war U.S. Field Artillery School had quietly reimagined the branch's central nervous system for the modern Army. Leaders such as Generals Leslie McNair and Jacob Devers insisted that every combat decision begin and end with calculation of shells available versus roads to deliver them. By the spring of 1944, that ethos had expanded across the Atlantic. In British depots coded Advanced Section, Communication Zone, and nicknamed ADSEC ComZed, tens of thousands of artillery rounds waited under tarpaulins, labeled by caliber, lot, and weight. Each shell was a crafted expression of industrial concentration, poured in Pittsburgh, stamped in Detroit, packed in cardboard tubes, shipped through Liverpool, and trucked to airfields or coastal hides ready to jump to France. Germany understood Allied numbers in theory, but no one on its staffs imagined the scale about to be unleashed. Their pre-invasion intelligence estimated 500,000 shells available for Overlord. The true figure exceeded 6 times that. Factories running night shifts in Pennsylvania, and Illinois produced so much ammunition that engineers joked about rivers of brass. Every American soldier who waded onto Omaha or Utah Beach was backed by a reservoir of fire so deep it could outlast any attritional. Plan the Wehrmacht hoped to enforce. The campaign that followed the landings turned artillery from a supporting arm into the central instrument of advance. The first shove inland after D-Day met an unforgiving geography. Bocage country, dense hedgerows, sunken lanes, fields hemmed by centuries-old earthen walls. Visibility rarely stretched beyond 30 yards, rendering tank guns blind and infantry exposed. So commanders relied on indirect fire. Battalions dug in behind natural slopes, fired blind by map and coordinate, constructing rolling barrages that walked across the landscape at walking speed. The principle was simple. Every hedge hid danger, so burn the hedge before touching it. For the Germans defending those tight corridors, the effect was suffocating. Veterans of Stalingrad and Kursk were accustomed to Soviet saturation, but there the shelling came in waves. In Normandy, it never ended. Once American lines fixed a target, the guns bracketed it precisely and maintained pressure for hours, day after day, until communication codes failed and morale collapsed. To German captains, it felt less like battle than punishment. Behind the thunder sat an invisible efficiency, thousands of quartermaster soldiers, engineers and drivers feeding each battery. Without relentless resupply, even the largest stockpile would exhaust itself in hours. By mid-June, those lines of transport had become lifelines stretching back to the Channel and into England's depots. And it was there, in the numbers of shells produced and moved, that the true war of endurance would be defined. The invasion force that stormed the beaches on D-Day was only the visible tip of an enormous logistical organism. Behind every rifleman in France stood 5 Americans abroad the supply chain, packing, shipping, and stacking ammunition that would form the pulse of the Western Front. The scale staggered even those who built it. By early June 1944, the U.S. Army had stockpiled over 144 million rounds of artillery ammunition in Great Britain. The depots stretched across the countryside like industrial suburbs, concrete bunkers hidden under camouflage nets. Rail cars continuously offloading crates marked 105 mm HE Lot 1944. Within hours of the first landings, these reserves began their migration toward Normandy, ferried by landing craft and cargo ships under constant threat of weather and U-boats. The first week's quota, more than 60,000 tons, crossed the Channel between June 7th and 14th without a day's interruption. The process was mechanical genius, married to human will. Ammunition arrived at sea in preloaded WW duck trucks driven straight onto the beaches. Each WW carried about 2 tons of shells, waterproofed in wax-lined tubes sorted by color codes for fuse types. Shore parties waded knee-deep through surf to push them onto makeshift ramps and gravel roads cut by bulldozers during the night. Within 48 hours, the first batteries inland were already resupplied and firing again. For the men of the U.S. Quartermaster and Transportation Corps, this was their own front line. They worked under canvas in rain and shrapnel, stacking ammunition in pyramids 20 feet high. Safety distance between piles, supposed to be 50 yards, shrank to 15. Space gave way to urgency. Ammunition dumps earned nicknames as if they were towns: Hell's Half Acre and Brass City, and simply the beach. From these temporary hubs, truck convoys fanned out into the hedgerow interior. Headlights blacked out, each canvas-covered vehicle stenciled with a white star and the word shells. When Allied engineers finished repairing Cherbourg Harbor in July, the operation expanded exponentially. Maritime cranes unloaded up to 8,000 tons a day, and American logistics officers could at last fulfill General Omar Bradley's standing order. Artillery will not run short. Not once. It never did. By contrast, the German 7th Army facing them survived on rationed fire. Ammunition deliveries arriving from across the Seine averaged only 1/16 of Allied daily expenditure. Wehrmacht depots in Brittany stood empty, gutted by Allied bombing. Captured documents later showed field commanders begging for a single trainload of shells to support entire corps. "We shoot like misers," one colonel recorded in his journal, "while the Americans shoot like millionaires." Yet even American abundance demanded discipline to prevent chaos. At every level from regiment to army group, fire missions required meticulous coordination through the Fire Direction Center, often no larger than a tent filled with maps, slide rules, and radio sets. When a forward observer called in coordinates, staff officers plotted the grid and selected which battalions would engage, sometimes upward of 40 batteries firing in sequence. The shells' flight times were staggered. so that dozens of explosions landed simultaneously on target, converting calculations into the illusion of instantaneous judgment. This synergy of mathematics, manpower, and industry would astonish captured Germans later interviewed after the breakout. Many described the sound of continuous shelling as rolling steel. Others likened it to standing inside a foundry. They understood too late that what thundered over their foxholes was not merely American courage, but the echo of assembly lines stretching back to Ohio, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, all synchronized to one order: keep firing. Through that rhythm, the Allies slowly ground the German 7th Army into exhaustion. But artillery did more than destroy. It dictated tempo. Every hour of sustained barrages reshaped command thinking, turning cautious attacks into orchestrated advances. And as the campaign pressed south toward St. Lo, the full power of American gunnery awaited its decisive demonstration, an explosion of steel that would redraw the Normandy front lines in a single week. By the summer of 1944, the U.S. Army's field artillery had evolved into a command organism so efficient that infantry rarely advanced without it. Each division's gunners operated like the nervous system of an immense creature, guided by mathematics rather than sight. Observers perched in church towers or tree lines relayed coordinates by radio, a disciplined fusion of geometry and urgency. A single fire mission could pass from rifle platoon to grid reference to impact in less than 3 minutes. Unlike British creeping barrages, American fire concentrated flexibly wherever resistance stiffened. Battery commanders trained to shift zones with mere compass bearings, blanketing pockets of enemy movement. Because the Americans standardized shells, propellant bags, and fuses across calibers, logistics and calculation meshed smoothly. Any gun anywhere could replace another in the regiment's line if mud or damage silenced its neighbor. German units often marveled that each new ridge brought the same unbroken tempo. They assumed radio jammers must have failed. In reality, the network was too redundant to disrupt. This mechanical reliability turned U.S. artillery into a thinking weapon on its own, a battlefield brain that pulsed constantly day and night. Technology gave American artillery a voice unlike any that Europe had heard. Where German batteries still depended on manual ranging and scarce optics, the Americans used portable radios, fire direction field calculators, and topographic survey teams that transformed France's hedgerows into measurable grids. Sound-ranging gear triangulated enemy pieces by listening to the delay between roar and echo, a primitive science of acoustics that pinpointed batteries hidden miles away behind trees. Forward observers carried compact SCR-610 or SCR-300 walkie-talkies, heavy by modern standards, but revolutionary in 1944. Their signals threaded the command maze from frontline foxholes to the tented computation centers crouched miles to the rear. Within those tents, officers plotted arcs on translucent overlays, microphones clicking as teletypists punched new azimuths to each firing platoon. Orders read like verse. Battery of fire 4-5 rounds he, fuse delay. Grid 9206. Seconds later, the air thundered. Each improvement, gyro-stabilized mountings. Proximity fuses tested secretly since 1943. Synchronized watch systems added speed or lethality. Even limited examples like radar-guided correction from Navy ships off Omaha Beach demonstrated that gunnery had entered the electronic age. Every blast carried not only explosive powder but the code of modern communication. The Germans, who once prided themselves on craftsmanship, now faced mechanized precision operating beyond that imagination. Beneath the glory of logistics stood the men who worked those miracles, crews of 6 to 8 around each weapon, their world reduced to recoil, smoke, and routine. They slept in holes under their howitzers, hands blistered from ramming shells, ears stuffed with cotton soaked in grease. Rain mixed with cordite until everything smelled of burnt earth. Typical missions demanded a pace that bent sanity, one round nearly every 30 seconds for hours. Crew chiefs counted by instinct: shove, ram, load, fire, repeat. The gun's shrink-wrapped precision depended entirely on human endurance. Mail from the front was filled with understatement. "Just plenty of noise," wrote a Kansas corporal. In truth, they lived inside organized chaos, casualties of stress more than shrapnel. To them, the figures later printed in War Department reports, 3 million shells at Normandy, compressed months of sweat into arithmetic. Each crater in France was a single heartbeat of their labor. Civilians later remembered the soundscape with awe. French farmers described nighttime barrages as trainloads of hail. For the Americans, who pulled lanyards until their palms bled, the war was measured not in miles advance but in spent cartridges stacked neck-high behind the pits. It was brutal yet methodical work, and it defined the rhythm of Allied progress on the continent. The men themselves hardly realized how completely their efficiency had astonished the foe. That understanding would come from enemy diaries recovered in the ruins of St. Lo, pages inked with disbelief, where German officers recorded a new kind of defeat measured in decibels and dust, captured, or diaries from the German 352nd Infantry and Panzerlehr divisions reveal repeated astonishment at the volume and accuracy of American fire. A lieutenant near St. Lo on July 10th wrote, "We are pinned by invisible machines. They fire by watch, not by sight. The ground itself is against us." To those educated in traditional European gunnery, where batteries conserved ammunition for decisive moments, the U.S. method seemed extravagant, bordering on madness. But the madness had mathematics behind it. German counter-battery crews tried responding, yet shortages of tubes, propellant, and air observation crippled them. The Luftwaffe, largely absent over Normandy, could not spot American positions. When shells did fall, Allied gunners shifted in minutes, re-registered, and resumed. What Wehrmacht soldiers encountered was the sound of industrial civilization mobilized to annihilate precision itself. After 2 hours, another diary reads, "We forgot to be brave." Their command posts were routinely buried. Communication lines fell silent beneath the percussion. Even seasoned veterans admitted paralysis. General Fritz Bayerlein of Panzerlehr reported to his superiors that the density of shellfire during Operation Cobra surpassed anything of the Great War. For officers raised on the legend of German technical superiority, realizing that another nation could mass more guns, more steel, and more coordination was a psychological collapse deeper than territorial loss. The phrase 3 million shells hides the miracle required to deliver them. Every round started its life inside America's home front, factories where women and teenagers filled the workforce once reserved for machinists, places like the Frankfurt Arsenal and the Chrysler Ordnance Division in Detroit. From these assembly lines, crates traveled by freight to East Coast ports, by convoy to Britain across the Channel by LST, then forward by truck to gun pits that moved daily with the front. It was a global choreography of motion devoted to one outcome: constancy of fire. To sustain that pace, the U.S. Army invented what logisticians called rolling supply. Shells were never stockpiled longer than 10 days. Instead, they flowed continuously, a pipeline of pressure impossible for any Axis power to duplicate. Fuel shortages that strangled German divisions never reached American gun crews because Red Ball Express convoys, 24 hours a day, fed both gasoline and ammunition to the line. Each truck carried roughly 200 rounds of 105mm, meaning that the famous figure of 3 million shells translated to nearly 15,000 truckloads, moving through Normandy's dirt roads in a single week. An empire on wheels. This relentless rhythm forged a new concept of modern war: firepower as logistics expressed physically. No soldier at St. Lo thought in those terms, but the doctrine was written in motion around them. Engineers grading roads to handle weight, mechanics replacing broken axles under moonlight, telegraph clerks punching endless requisition codes, generals from other Allied nations visiting a U.S. supply depot remarked that they looked less like armies than corporations with detonators. They were right. For the Americans, artillery promised security. For the Germans, it dismantled the sense that skill alone could overcome numbers. Under barrages lasting days, discipline disintegrated atom by atom. Reports of deafness, shell shock, and desertion multiplied. Prisoners captured after Cobra often answered interrogation with the same phrase: "We could not lift our heads." Their surrender was less an act of fear than physical resignation to sound, yet constant fire also scarred its deliverers. Gunners developed their own superstitions: lucky fuses, lucky gloves, the belief that one slow reload might shift destiny. When silence briefly fell, they felt unease, as though normal absence of sound meant danger. Post-campaign medical surveys found the artillery branch suffered among the highest rates of combat fatigue, Despite low direct casualty numbers, they were victims of their own thunder. Civilian witnesses saw messianic symbolism in the spectacle, France's liberation arriving through metallic rain. But behind liberation stood mechanized awe, grim in its impersonality. Firepower, this immense separated war from courage. It rewarded organization over heroism. That truth unsettled commanders on both sides. It defined what the modern battlefield would become. Less clash of men, more contest of systems. And in that evolving theater, the American system held every advantage. What followed next would prove it beyond argument. A 7-day storm of shells culminating in the shattering of the Norman front. The moment when noise itself turned strategy into victory. In late July 1944, 6 weeks after D-Day, the Allied line in Normandy had stalled. The bocage, the hedgerow maze that twisted every mile into ambush, had ground offensives to exhaustion. Tanks could not maneuver, infantry could not see. Operation Cobra, conceived by General Omar Bradley, aimed to break the deadlock by force of mathematics. If terrain blocked movement, dissolve the terrain. Preparations began 10 days before the assault. Ammunition trains from Cherbourg and the beaches fed into new dumps west of St. Lo. Stacked 6 feet high were boxes marked 105mm HE shell, handle with care, sealed against the rain under waxed tarpaulins. Artillery planners computed the ratio for saturation, roughly 20 tons per square kilometer of target zone. The numbers broadened until they lost meaning. More than 1/500 guns of every caliber. Over 3 million rounds scheduled for 1 week of fire missions feeding the central day of eruption, 25 July 1944. At precisely 05:45 hours, after 30 minutes of naval pre-bombardment, the American guns opened their own overture. Witnesses said the air thickened, an acoustic fog. Forward observers could no longer relay coordinates because even shouting into radios accomplished nothing. The thunder drowned language. For 38 minutes, nearly 90,000 shells rained on a 6-square-mile sector, held by the 2nd SS Panzer Division. Tree lines disintegrated. Telephone poles snapped as though hit by invisible trains. Inside those killing rectangles, the German front simply stopped existing. Corporal Horst Gärtner, survivor of Panzer Lehr, recalled later, "We saw nothing, only the soil rising like waves. The mind left the body. For hours the barrage extended east and west, a rolling tectonic plate of concussions moving at 16 yards per second. An American observer described it with awe rather than triumph. It looked like an earthquake marching. By 0800 the ground assault began. Infantry of the 9th and 30th Divisions advanced into smoke so dense that soldiers lost sight of their own boots. German positions appeared only as flashes of residual fire, most already silenced. Tank destroyers and Shermans crossed the wreckage of what had been entire battalions. Machine guns lay half-melted, gun shields torn backward by pressure blast. In some sectors, American units found lines of German soldiers sitting upright, killed not by fragments but by concussion, stilled by air that had turned liquid. Fire direction centers worked without pause. Entire staffs hoarse from repeating grid adjustments. Couriers moved between batteries to relieve broken communications. For frontline infantry, the spectacle merged horror and relief. Every foot forward was guarded by an unseen storm behind them. When observers signaled fresh resistance, it vanished under renewed salvos within minutes. By night, the artillerymen had achieved the impossible. 2,000 tons of shells expended in 1 day without exhausting their supply. Convoys rolled up continuously, headlights painted blue against blackout screens bringing replacement loads from Cherbourg. Shell casings, golden under moonlight, piled knee-high around the gun pits. Somewhere in that chaos, German command lost its vocabulary for defense. Forward units stopped responding. Liaison officers wandered without bearings. And in the late hours of 25 July, aerial reconnaissance confirmed what no general could confess aloud. The southern front of Normandy had been erased. Bayerlein's Panzer Lehr Division, once the pride of the Armored Corps, had ceased to exist as a coherent formation. The door to France stood open, and behind it, every U.S. crew and every battery kept firing, the rhythm of their howitzers echoing down the valley like the heartbeat of an empire that had learned to turn industry into thunder. When the guns finally paused for recalibration, the silence that followed felt unnatural, an emptiness measured by the ears of men who had reshaped geography. That brief pause marked neither victory nor relief, only the turn of the war's axis. From it, the breakout would surge, transforming local triumph into continental momentum. The morning after Cobra's opening barrage, the world beyond St. Lo looked like another planet. Trees had dissolved into black spikes, cattle smoked in open fields, and roads had split open from concussions so deep they exposed their pre-Roman stones. For miles, no sound remained except the soft hiss of dust settling back to earth. The Americans called it the moonlight landscape. The Germans called it Höllenfeuer, hellfire. Through that ruin, the United States Army began to move like water through broken glass. Columns of Sherman tanks pushed across gaps where minefields had been vaporized by indirect fire, followed by half-tracks towing more guns forward. The artillery orgy that had begun as a stationary battering now metamorphosed into a traveling orchestra accompanying the advance. Every 4 hours, the front leapt forward, and with it leapt the guns. Self-propelled M7 priests bounced along cratered roads, pausing only long enough for survey crews to refix their coordinates before joining the next chorus of thunder. General Bradley's staff inside the trailer at the edge of Coutances monitored the push, through radio chatter rendered almost poetic by exhaustion. 1,000 yards south. Repeat fire mission Bravo. Enemy gone to vapor. What had been a defensive line only 12 hours earlier became a corridor of retreat clogged with burning half-tracks. German counterattacks collapsed against continuous curtain fire. Even Wehrmacht armor found itself paralyzed, not through destruction alone but through sensory overload. A veteran panzer commander later wrote, "It was as if the sea itself bombarded us. One seeks shelter and finds none, for the shells arrive faster than thought." American forward observers, riding atop tanks with radios strapped to their backs, guided the barrage in front of the advance like sweeping headlights. Infantry officers no longer spoke of distance in miles or yards. They calculated progress by minutes of fire. The map of Normandy was rewritten in shell concentrations rather than towns. This was what U.S. doctrine had promised on paper. Overwhelming fire integrated with mobility, destruction feeding maneuver, feeding further destruction. Operation Cobra became the execution proof of theory. By 29th July, 7th Army Command in the German sector had ceased functioning. Outposts west of Avranches deafened and choking in dust, confused friend for foe. The corps of Fritz Bayerlein and Paul Hauser were retreating on impulse, their radio nets shattered. The fire that had destroyed their trenches now chewed at the roads behind them. Small surviving groups described grotesque illusions, trees shaking though no shells fell, or rain falling crimson from pulverized clay. Their commanders no longer spoke of regrouping, only of escape to the Seine. Behind them surged the material proof of American supremacy. Bradley's army advanced 30 miles in 3 days, an acceleration unheard of since trench warfare had defined stalemate. German Field Marshal Guenther von Klug admitted privately to staff that Normandy was lost not to courage but to arithmetic. "We have entered a war of mines and factories. They have both." As the breakout raged across Brittany and into the open plains beyond Mortagne, the artillery never rested. Each evening, quartermasters counted shell expenditure with stupefied calm. 3 million rounds in 7 days. Nearly 200,000 tons of steel and explosives poured into a region smaller than Rhode Island. Even the Allies' own airmen orbiting above could no longer distinguish between man-made smoke and the natural haze of summer. Earth itself seemed to burn illumination. The German imagination, once fed on the mechanical pride of blitzkrieg, had no defense against this new arithmetic of annihilation. Every doctrine that had once celebrated efficiency now drowned in abundance. Back in Berlin, staff intelligence summarized the collapse with bureaucratic despair. The opponent's artillery possesses ammunition stocks of incomprehensible volume. Resistance in Normandy can no longer be described in military terms. Out of those lines of ink grew the coming momentum of liberation. For the soldiers who had manned the guns that week, exhaustion replaced triumph. They had fired so long that silence felt foreign. Yet that silence carried the echo of turning history. The German Western Front was cracked open. From its fracture poured the torrents that would eventually sweep to Paris and the Rhine. And in every report, in every stunned diary captured on the run, one sentence repeated, "They fired without pause as if America itself were in the guns." What followed was aftermath, the reckoning of numbers, and the realization. On both sides, that firepower had changed forever what strategy meant. In the first quiet days after the breakout, American units south of Coutances moved through landscapes unrecognizable even to their own maps. Whole orchards had vanished, craters filled with stagnant water, shell fragments, and the remains of artillery's grammar. A twisted alphabet of brass, fuse caps, and timing rings. When rain finally returned in early August, it hissed upon half-melted soil, sealing the week's violence beneath a gray crust. War correspondents arriving from London struggled to describe what they saw. Richard Tregaskis of the International News Service wrote, "It resembled the surface of another planet, a geography rearranged by industry." For U.S. gunners exhausted and half-deaf, the statistics arriving from staff headquarters read like science fiction. 3,000 shells expended, 150,000 tons of ammunition moved through beachheads, and over 18,000 tons fired in a single 24-hour period during the heaviest barrages. Each gunner's body now became the metric of that achievement. Bruised shoulders, blistered hands, eyes bloodshot from blast shock. Logisticians pored over ledgers trying to understand how the system had survived itself. Cherbourg's rebuilt docks had processed nearly 4 times the tonnage, projected for July. The Red Ball Express convoys created, during Cobra's peak, moved 1 truckload of artillery ammunition every 40 seconds along newly designated supply routes. Maintenance crews treated bent axles and blown tires as badges of efficiency. An entire sub-branch of the Quartermaster Corps labeled itself informally Shell Command. In Germany, investigators attempted to quantify what they had endured. Captured reports from the 7th Army's staff estimated American barrages around Saint-Lô and Mortain at 10 times the weight fired at Verdun in 1916. Survivors used phrases like earthquake front or iron rain without end. The Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, High Command, commissioned an evaluation of American artillery methods, believing they must rely on some new technological secret. The report returned a simple conclusion. The secret was quantity tied to communication. Numbers defeated theater. The enemy had converted industry into weather. For the Americans who lived through it, pride was tempered by fatigue. When the 80 Corps' gun crews finally halted for inspection, spent shell casings formed walls around their positions, gleaming rows stretching like metallic vineyards. One sergeant wrote home, "We didn't win by bravery. We won by machinery that never jammed." It was both boast and confession. Even within Allied circles, generals privately asked whether such massive destruction marked progress or moral surrender. General Bradley's own diary recorded the tension. "We have learned to pile strength upon strength, perhaps too well." But moral reflection would come later. In the immediate aftermath, there was only movement, mechanized, unstoppable. The artillery that had broken Normandy now turned east toward the Seine, firing less frequently but with the same orchestral precision. New stockpiles arrived, new batteries replaced worn barrels, the war shifting from surging waves of shells to steady advance. In every headquarters report, the same conclusion appeared. No army in history had ever achieved such firepower logistics, and none could now resist its consequence. As liberated Parisians cheered and retreating, Germans looked west in disbelief. Analysis departments at SHAEF already began evaluating what the experience meant for warfare itself. The answers revealed a revolution in thinking. Strategy no longer resided exclusively in plans or bravery. It lived inside supply tables and factory lines. Yet that reckoning, the transformation of artillery from support to symbol, was still unfolding, a reckoning that would define the modern military age. The statistics arriving from France in late August 1944 stunned even the War Department. By conservative count, U.S. artillery had hurled an average of 400,000 shells each day during Operation Cobra's peak week. Ammunition expenditure exceeded the entire Civil War's total in 7 days. And yet the supply chain had not cracked. Factories in Pennsylvania, Illinois, and Ohio had continued to outproduce destruction with almost effortless momentum. That margin of output defined the coming age, war driven less by strategy than by flow rate. Across Europe, Allied commanders took note. British officers accustomed to measured fire marveled at the Yankee deluge. One recorded in his journal, "They shoot as if rifles were pocket change." The French populace, initially terrified by the rolling bombardments, began calling the Americans les forgerons du tonnerre, the blacksmiths of thunder. For liberated civilians, artillery had become paradox. Both terror and salvation, the storm that burned away occupation. In Germany, returning survivors of the Normandy front briefed the general staff on what they had faced. Their psychological collapse mattered as much as tactical defeat. Officers who once preached nerve and precision now spoke in metaphors. The battlefield was melted. Post-war interrogations revealed a consistent phrase, nie wieder so ein Feuer, never again such fire. For the first time since 1939, the German army acknowledged an opponent whose superiority lay not in genius, but in systemization. It signaled the twilight of heroic warfare. American analysts translated these confessions into data, feeding them into the Army's post-war field artillery publications. Tables compared shell tonnage at Normandy to earlier campaigns, determining optimum rates of fire per yard of advance. The cold abstractions of those documents masked the moral enormity of what had occurred, yet they defined future doctrine. Through the Korean War and into Vietnam, every officer trained under the principle born in France. If you can locate the enemy, you can bury him in minutes. Normandy had proved the equation. For the soldiers who had served in those gun crews, life never fully quieted. Many returned home hard of hearing, startled by thunder for decades afterwards. Some kept souvenir casings polished on mantelpieces. Others refused to speak of the noise. Veteran associations described an emptiness common among artillerymen, the dissonance of having delivered victory from miles away, never seeing those they killed. Infantry knows faces, one gunner said. We only knew coordinates. Yet even within that silence lay pride. Their accuracy and endurance had saved thousands of comrades who would otherwise have faced machine guns at close range. Artillery's curtain made the breakout and thus the liberation of Europe inevitable. The success reverberated through U.S. military culture as proof that organization and innovation could triumph where valor alone might fail. By year's end, Supreme Headquarters calculated that the Normandy artillery campaign had used nearly one-third of all munitions fired by the U.S. Army in the entire European theater. Factories replacing those stocks would run until the day Japan surrendered. The guns had written the proof of America's industrial creed, that war could be turned into production. Victory measured in decimals of efficiency, transformed into pressure waves and craters. When historians reviewed the battle maps decades later, they marked Cobra's lines not only as tactical achievements but as coordinates of transformation. The moment modern warfare crossed from bravery into mass capability. The thunder that rolled over Normandy in July 1944 did more than shatter German armies. It announced that in the conflicts to come, steel and system would speak louder than strategy. From that recognition grows the reflection that still defines the 20th century's legacy of firepower. When the thunder finally faded from Normandy's hills, the world awoke to a new definition of strength. The shells that fell across the French bocage were more than projectiles. They were the language of an industrial civilization declaring its arrival on the battlefield. The United States had turned foundries, assembly lines, and rail networks into components of a single weapon that fired from coast to coast. For Germany, the week of fire was revelation through ruin. That courage and tactics meant little against arithmetic made visible. For America, it was vindication of patience, the proof that organization could be as decisive as heroism. The 3 million shells that rained on Normandy wrote both a victory and a warning. Once war became scalable, its boundaries disappeared. Artillery had always been called the king of battle, but in 1944 the crown changed shape. Its jewels were factories, its throne the logistics map, its subjects the quiet hands loading one round after another in mud and smoke. In those hands lay the real story of modern war, ordinary men converting calculation into liberation. Long after the echoes died, French farmers unearthed casings engraved 1944 USA and stacked them beside harvest fields. They no longer sounded like destruction but like applause from a vanished storm. A reminder that on the road from St. Lo to Paris, freedom advanced to the rhythm of American guns. Their cadence still rolls faintly through history, the measured, unstoppable pulse of a nation that learned how to turn metal into momentum and thunder into victory.